could have imagined 40 years ago at that Schloss out in Luxembourg that this little international institute in 40 years would fill this room with so many distinguished people? It's almost unbelievable. And I feel so honored to be here, not only on behalf of Norman Neureiter, but just on behalf of all the IIASA friends who thought maybe I was an appropriate person to come and speak to you. So let me begin with the fact that Norman Neureiter may not remember it, but our initial connection was due to IIASA because a good friend and colleague of mine named Eugene Skolnikov had won a competition at IIASA and had a 3-year, rather large research program in international treaties concerning the environment. Eugene Skolnikov and his graduate student David Victor were the chief investigators. They produced a magnificent study, and I won't go into that because the point is that Gene Skolnikov, who directed that study, was invited to give a lecture at the United States Department of State. And because I lived in the Washington area, I could attend. And after the lecture, there was a small dinner for about 30 of us. And it turned out that the host of the dinner was a guy named Norman Neureiter, whom I didn't know. And I asked, who is Norman Neureiter? And I was told, he's the scientific advisor to the Secretary of State. And I asked, since that is about as high as you can go in the U.S. government, how come I don't know who he is? And the answer was, he's one of those people who believes that it's better to be a private, confidential advisor to somebody like the Secretary of State than to be an external spokesperson who glorifies himself by pretending to be the Department of State's scientific person. Well, I thought, that's quite a self-effacing kind of position. I only learned tonight, by the way, Norm was the first such special advisor. The fourth was William Kohlglaser, who was sitting at the table with me just a few minutes ago. I met Bill Kohlglaser 20 years ago, and nothing much ever came of our meeting except that I knew his name, and I knew whenever I heard his name who he was, and I almost never heard his name. and it turns out that he is in the tradition of Norm Neureiter, namely, keep quiet, give advice, don't exalt yourself in public. Well, the next occasion I had to know who Norman Neureiter was, he had volunteered to head the campaign to solicit donations to an endowment fund for the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, to make that institute a more assuredly permanent institute for systems analysis. Well, you know, I've known enough about fundraising in my career to know that there is no more thankless job than raising money for some kind of good institute. You can't make any friends, you can't get famous, can't make any money. All you can do is devote your time. But there was Norm Neureiter doing that, and then I realized he was affiliated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I had been a dues-paying member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for at least 40 years, and I always assumed that it was the American Association for the Advancement of American science. Here he was promoting an institute in Luxembourg with people from all kinds of nations, nothing to do with American science. And I thought, at least Norm, if not the whole IIAS, thinks of science as something that is universal, globally worthwhile, not so much the possession of a nation like the United States of America or even Japan. Well, then the next thing that happened was that a year ago, I got an invitation to an elaborate Gala event at the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. What could it be? It turned out that just about every scientific dignitary in the Washington area, presidents of national academies and presidential science advisors and all of those people, and people from all across the United States of America had congregated in the Japanese embassy, I don't know, 200 people, to celebrate the decoration of Norman Neureiter by the Emperor of Japan with the Order of the Rising Sun. Can you imagine anything like the Order of the Rising Sun from the Emperor of Japan? Well, that had happened months ago, but before they could arrange the celebration in Washington, that dreadful tsunami occurred, which did so much damage in Japan, including the Fukushima nuclear reactor complex, that they had postponed the Washington celebration until this occasion. And at that occasion, I realized that Norm Neureiter was being celebrated for, and this literally is what it said, 20 years of devotion to the promotion of science in Japan. Now, the 20 years may have been an exaggeration, I don't know. But apparently the Emperor of Japan was convinced that Norman had devoted enough years, so he could call it 2 decades, to Japanese science or Japanese scientists. And I thought, you know, I totally misread this American Association for the Advancement of Science to think it was an American institution. It's not, as evidenced by Norm Neureiter. And then, to my astonishment, I got invited to come to Vienna for another sovereign state. Recognize this guy as somebody who deserves to be celebrated by, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 800 people in this glorious room. So, all I can say is that I am so honored to have been selected by my IIASA friends to be able to say a word or two about my good friend Norm Neureiter. And I hope if any of you are the least tempted to applaud my remarks here, make sure we all know we're applauding Norm Neureiter.